It was pitch black, so I missed a step on the ladder, and then my leg slipped. The damage she suffered to her head due to the fall has resulted in severe internal bleeding in her brain, resulting in a coma. But I wasn't in a coma. That meant that I could hear everything. A year quickly turned into 2, and I felt the person I used to be disappearing. I had to find a way to stay here, in this world. I remember loving science, but I no longer remembered any of the stuff that we'd learned at school. At the same time, my mind clung onto those memories, and at the same time, started creating new ones that hadn't existed before. I had to find a way to stay here, in this world. Even if I had to create my own world inside my head. Maisie became my best friend. She always visited on Sundays. Every time she came, she talked about our classmates. How Sophie had fallen in love with Joe, and how Kit had failed the math test, so the teacher had punished him by making him solve 10 equations in front of the whole class. Maisie's visits, though they were only in my head, were the best parts of my day. I didn't know that what I was doing in order to entertain myself was actually a kind of exercise for my damaged mind. I didn't realize that I was helping myself get better. If I'd known, I wouldn't have waited 3 years to start doing it. My consciousness was slowly returning. You might wonder, how did I realize that? Well, simply, I felt my eyelids flutter whenever Maisie visited me. Believe it or not, our thoughts have incredible power. But even so, no one knew that I was coming out of a coma. Ever since I'd first been diagnosed as being in a coma, I was totally aware of everything happening around me, exactly like a normal person. But I was stuck inside a silent body, it seemed, a mind full of life that no one noticed. I started accepting this cruel fate and got lost in my made-up thoughts. Suddenly, I could no longer tell the difference between what was real and what wasn't. There's a fine line that separates memory from imagination, and I'd clearly overstepped it. But the one thing I was absolutely certain of was that the fights my parents had and my mom's betrayal were 100% real. After 4 years, my mom had had enough of me. How long must I endure moving this body left and right without any response? She would yell in my dad's face, and he would answer, until she dies. Imagine being in my position, not being able to speak to a friend, not feeling loved anymore, not having any ambitions or dreams, no hope of being able to look forward to anything. All my thoughts were miserable ones. I lived in fear, and if I was being honest, I was waiting for death so I could escape from all of this. I pictured myself dying in some nursing home, cold and alone. And so that's how I spent those 4 long years. Snowball's existence was my only comfort. My eyelids started fluttering a lot. You might think that's not really a big deal. Anyone can do that without trying, but that wasn't the case with me. Snowball noticed what was going on and started to bark for hours and hours without stopping. My mom couldn't tolerate it. My dad came home and Snowball continued to bark. Everyone went to bed and Snowball was still barking. He was just like me, wishing for someone to realize that I was still with them. But what happened was the opposite of what we hoped for. The next day, his barking stopped completely. I didn't know what had happened to him. Mom must have gotten rid of him. I was really worried about him. Snowball was my only friend, the only one that made me feel that I wasn't actually dead. He disappeared. That day, I heard some heated discussion between my parents. You might say that nothing was new, but this time it was different. My mom decided to leave my dad. She accused him of having never been the perfect husband. She was crazy. He was the coolest dad a girl could ever wish for. He tried to persuade her to stay, but it was pointless. She screamed at the top of her voice, "It would have been better if she died that day. It's like a curse that won't go away unless I leave." The sound of the door slamming was the last thing I heard that day. I was incapable of changing any of the things around me or even the way my mom and dad looked at me. I was an invisible, silent watcher to how people acted when they thought no one was looking. Unfortunately, I wasn't just a watcher. Because of my inability to communicate with people, I became the perfect victim. A creature that looked like it was devoid of emotions. For 4 years, my mom used to abuse me mentally and physically. What did I ever do to her to deserve that? A part of me wanted to cry, and the other part wanted to fight. I was so full of pain and sadness. It was torture. The following day, it was like I no longer existed inside the house. My dad was really depressed. He moved me to a nursing home, exactly like I'd expected would happen. I felt worthless now without Snowball, and without people around me. I became even more of a shell of my former self. Another year went by and everyone still thought I was in a deep coma. In the nursing house, everything was so quiet. No voices, no movements, and no talking. Just a stranger who moved me left and right every day and who made sure that my machines were working normally. The 6-year mark came and went, and then the 7th, and everything was the same. I used to figure out that the time from the nurses changing shifts every 6 hours. That meant that on the 4th time I was moved, a day would have passed. No one visited me during the 3 years that I spent there except my friend Maisie. No one cared about me but her. I lived in terror. I knew every day would be exactly the same as the last one, over and over again. I totally lost any hope I had of hearing another person's voice. But then one night, my dad decided to visit me. I had no idea what date it was because I'd lost all sense of time. But it happened to be my 20th birthday. He held my hand and I couldn't believe it when I heard his voice. It felt like a dream. He told me, "You won't be alone anymore. I'll be with you forever from now on. I can't believe you just turned 20. Emotions welled up in me and suddenly I could feel the familiar fluttering of my eyelids. I had to open my eyes. I couldn't stay like this anymore. My dad had his face buried in my shoulder and he was crying. He couldn't see my face or my eyes, but when he turned his head, he jumped and ran outside screaming at the top of his voice, "Doctor, I need a doctor!" Perhaps emotions have more power than we realize. My dad's love for me made me open my eyes once again. The doctors ran some tests on me and none of them could explain what had happened. They only said the damage that her head suffered was apparently able to heal with time. Your daughter is out of her coma. To make sure I was able to hear them, the doctor asked me to blink twice. And I did it! Being able to communicate again, even in a simple way, felt like the best thing in the world. But even more than that was the fact that I was no longer a nobody. Dad was so excited. He didn't even know where to begin. But my movement and reactions were still limited. It would take time. There were seriously times where I almost gave up, but I had to hold on to this. My dad promised never to leave me alone, and he kept his word. At night, my dad moved my bed towards the window. It was the first time I'd seen the sky for the last 7 years. At that moment, a star fell from the sky. I closed my eyes and wished to be able to speak again. I mean, there must have been a reason for the star to fall at that moment, right? It couldn't have been a coincidence. That night, my dad told me about that dark day. He told me how Snowball ran home barking nonstop. My mom tried to shut him up and to kick him out, but he refused. He bit my dad's pants and kept pushing until my dad came with him outside. From afar, he saw me motionless on the ground. He panicked and drove me to the hospital in a hurry. There, they told him that there was no hope. But my dad wouldn't give up. He knew there would come a day where I'd be okay again. He must have gotten sick of waiting for that day. It's true that I was happy for recovering gradually. But even then, I didn't feel completely free. People around me were still controlling everything. When and what I ate, if I could stay in bed, or if I should be sitting on a chair. It didn't matter how many times I blinked, I couldn't say anything except for yes and no. One day, my dad came in all happy. He told me that the doctors had finally agreed to let him take me on a wheelchair around the city. It was the first time in so long that I get to move and finally leave my bed. I was scared. The outside world must have changed a lot. I didn't know if I should go. But I needed this. It was time to get back out there. I remember one moment from that day very vividly. My dad left me alone in the car on our way back in order to buy something quickly from the store. A woman passed by, looked at me and smiled. I didn't know the reason behind her smile back then, and I'll never know. But that small smile, a small human interaction, made me feel better again. That woman's smile is what pushed me to continue. Seeing my dad come into my room was always the best moment of my day. However, I wasn't pleased when my dad entered my room with the press who came to listen to my story. Apparently, they decided that my story was worth being told and shared. The press ruined my peace and quiet. My mom even returned just so she could be in the spotlight. She returned after disappearing for so long, just for fame. The press did help a bit though. My dad had them help us look for solutions and treatments that might help me get better. My mom, though, well, she didn't exactly show up because she suddenly remembered the importance of family. She was just there for fame, and Dad wanted me to decide if she could stay or not. Mom's answer was, "My dear daughter, do you want your mommy back in your life?" I blinked nonstop, and this meant I wanted her to go, because I knew she didn't care if I lived or died. My dad was a person who'd taken care of me my whole life. Of course he had weak moments where he wasn't by my side, but at least he still loved me enough and thought of me all the time. And for me, that was enough. And guess what? My dad got in contact with one of the big companies that made medical devices. They had created a device that gets implanted inside the brain and is connected to a special computer. The device sends electric waves to the computer that then says the words out loud. That company heard about my condition in the media and were happy to help me. The first time they tried this on me was pretty funny. Everything I said made everyone laugh, but for me it was sad because I never got an answer to my question. What I asked was, what happened to my dog Snowball? My story might be sad. Some of you might believe it, and others will say that it is just a product of my imagination. But what can't be denied is that there are a lot of people like me in this world who no one knows anything about because they don't have the ability to connect with people. It wouldn't hurt to act nicely towards them and not to ignore them, because like me, they have feelings too. My suffering lasted for 7 years, but I truly believe that the star that fell that night was the reason my wish of being able to talk again came true. Everything happens for a reason.
I opened my eyes and squinted. The light was so bright, and for a moment I almost forgot where I was. That moment didn't last for long though, because almost immediately I felt them. It was as if someone had come along and attached 2 coconuts to my chest. Was this what it felt like to have big breasts? I'd done it! I'd really done it! I was now the proud and slightly in pain owner of a 34 double D pair of breasts. I tried to sit upright against the back of the hospital bed, but it hurt. The surgeon had warned me that I'd feel tender for the first week or so, but I hadn't expected it to be this painful. How would I even get out of bed? A nurse passed by and saw me struggling. She propped me up against the bed and told me I needed to rest. Then she smiled reassuringly at me and told me that I looked great. Did I wondered. Or had this all been a mistake? I allowed myself to get lost in my thoughts for a bit, thinking back to all those moments in high school where I'd allowed my insecurities to get the better of me. It's not like I was ugly or anything, but had I been the most flat-chested girl in school? Yes, I had been, and it had bothered me a lot. I remember this one time when Savannah, the most popular girl in school, had invited us all to her sweet 16th pool party. I'd been so terrified of everyone seeing how non-existent my chest was that I'd actually stuffed my baby brother's Play-Doh inside my bikini top. It had been the closest thing I could find that might have been similar in texture to breasts, and when I looked in the mirror nervously before the party, I thought they looked pretty real. Of course, I hadn't anticipated that Drake would come up behind me and push me into the pool, my Play-Doh fake breasts falling out of my bikini top and landing with a plop on the surface of the pool. I remember the horror and shame I felt as they sunk to the bottom, and that was pretty much the turning point for me. Never lived it down. From that day on, I was constantly teased about it, even my so-called friends who still bought me Play-Doh every time it was my birthday. And of course, Savannah's voice still echoed inside my head. You know, Polly, if you're that desperate for bigger breasts, why not just get surgery? Like, if I was as flat as a pancake like you are, I'd defo get surgery. And so that was why I found myself lying on this bed in the cosmetic surgery ward, staring down at my new breast implants. I told myself it wasn't because of Savannah, and that it wasn't because of the pool incident. It was because I was an independent young woman, and I could do whatever I wanted. If I wanted bigger breasts to make me feel secure, then so what? And I paid for them myself. Okay, that last part is a bit of a lie. You see, when I went off to college, my parents gave me an allowance for the whole year. My parents aren't that well off, so I knew I had to budget carefully. Well, I'm sure you can guess what I did. I got to college, located the nearest cosmetic surgeon, and scheduled an appointment. I was supposed to bring someone along with me so that they could drive me home, but there was no one I felt comfortable enough telling. I mean, of course, people would notice soon. It's not like I could hide them from anyone. They were huge. I'm pretty petite, so they stood out a lot. That first week, I wore baggy sweaters to hide them. They were a bit bruised from the surgery, so I didn't want anyone else to see until they were fully healed. I was staying in a dorm with 2 other freshman girls, and so there was no way they wouldn't notice. They squealed when I showed them, and one of them said, "Oh, girl, the guys are going to be all over you." And they were. After they'd healed, I felt confident enough to wear low-cut tops for the first time in my life. No longer did I need to hide my flat chest. I felt feminine, and maybe now I'd finally get a boyfriend. No guys had been interested in me in high school, and I convinced myself that it was because I'd had no breasts. Well, hi boys, look at me now. And they did look. They looked a lot. I was still shy, so whenever I caught someone staring at them, I blushed. Eventually, though, I started to enjoy the attention I was getting. It made me feel like I mattered, and that I was attractive. Pretty soon after, I met a guy called George at a party, and he asked me if I'd like to go out with him sometime. I was so excited that I said yes, and then quickly ran off to find my friends to tell them. They hugged me and we did a celebratory dance. Then I realized that it was kind of rude of me to run off like that, so I headed back to the room where George was. As I entered the room, I couldn't see him. Then I spotted him. He was standing with a group of guys and they were all laughing. As I got closer, I realized what they were laughing at. He was holding 2 balloons in front of his chest, and even though the music was loud, I could still hear what he was saying. "Hi guys, I'm Polly. Do you like my fake breasts? Look at me! Look at me!" I was so humiliated. He'd literally just asked me out on a date, and yet there he was mocking me in front of everyone. He was no different from the boys I'd gone to high school with. I ran out of there in tears and didn't stop running until I was back in my room. How had he even known they were fake? And why did he think it was okay to laugh at me like that behind my back? I suddenly felt so lonely. All I wanted was to go home to my parents, tell them what I'd done and hope that they'd forgive me, but I couldn't. They'd be so angry at me and they'd probably never want to speak to me again. The worst part was that I had to see George every day as we were in the same class. He didn't even have the guts to come and apologize to me. I knew someone must have seen me crying and running out because he didn't speak to me ever again and never asked me why I wasn't interested in that date with him. It was because of him that I started thinking, had I made a mistake? Why couldn't I win? I was teased for being flat-chested, and then I was teased for having implants. Would the suffering ever end? I kind of fell into a bit of a depressive slump after that, and I should probably have mentioned earlier how much I loved ballet. I had been taking classes ever since I was a little girl, but now, since having my implants, it was not the same anymore. That first class after the surgery was really tough. I didn't feel as light on my feet anymore, and the more I practiced, the more pain I felt. Every time I did a pirouette, I would get a sharp pain in my back. My ballet teacher could see that I was in pain and said that maybe the implants were too big for me. After all, I was very petite. The one thing I thought would change my life for the better was actually destroying it. Boys thought I was shallow, I was in pain, and even my ballet teacher was treating me differently. And to top it all off, I was seriously running out of cash. I'd spent 90% of my allowance for the year on the surgery, and I barely had enough left to pay for food. There was nothing else for it. I'd have to get a job. I applied to a few bookshops, but none of them hired me. It got into my head that it was because of my implants. They were judging me and assuming I was some bimbo. Finally, I decided to apply to a diner. I saw they had an ad out front, and when I went in to ask about it, they hired me on the spot. In fact, they pretty much hired my breasts on the spot, because that was the only place the manager was looking. I swear he didn't make eye contact with me once. I felt sick at the thought of working for such a man, but also I needed the money desperately. My life became a monotonous routine of study, work, sleep, and I was in so much pain from the implants that I ended up having to see a chiropractor to try and help ease the back pain I was getting. It was a never-ending cycle, and every spare dollar I had went towards finding a more comfortable bra to support my implants or on pain medication. Christmas was coming, and that meant I would have to see my parents. There was no way I could hide this from them, and they were already pretty angry at me as my grades weren't as good as they used to be. I could hardly tell them that I spent every waking hour working instead of studying because I'd spent all their money on trying to boost my confidence. It was seriously a disaster! Just before Christmas, I was working on one of my last shifts at the diner for the year. I felt relieved to get out of there. I was sick of my manager staring at my chest, and that shift was no different. I have never been so upset in all my life. All those fears I'd had about people perceiving me as shallow and attention-seeking were coming to the surface, especially that I was never used to it before the surgery. As I walked home in the snow, tears running down my cheeks, I made the decision to tell my parents and ask them to help me to get these stupid implants removed. Getting breast implants was the worst thing I'd ever done in my life. I couldn't live like this anymore. Well, my parents were, of course, furious, but more than that, they were upset. Upset that I'd been such an insecure teenager, and upset that I'd betrayed their trust like this. That Christmas vacation, they could see how much pain and humiliation my implants brought me, and without me even asking them, they offered to pay for me to get them removed. I didn't even have to think about it. I knew it was the right decision, and I was so unbelievably grateful that my parents supported me, even after how I'd betrayed them. I can't explain the lightness I felt when they were removed, not just physically, but also mentally. I felt like a weight had been taken off of me. I could breathe again and practice ballet. And I even got a job in the library so that I could pay my parents back for the removal surgery. This time, no one looked at my chest. In fact, no one even cared. I realized that my insecurity about the size of my breasts was self-inflicted, and that true friends couldn't care less about how big or small they were. Getting implants was seriously the biggest mistake I've ever made. But hey, if I hadn't done it, I might not be as happy and comfortable in my own skin as I am today. I guess there's always a lesson to be learned, even if it's a pretty painful one.